Hey everyone, this is Teresa from Base 10 Montessori, and today I want to go over Chapter 13 of The Absorbent Mind by Maria Montessori. And Chapter 13 is called The Importance of Movement in General Development. So in Chapter 13, we're going to take a look at the nervous system. So she's going to talk a lot about the nervous system and how it connects to the development of the mind and the development of the will or willpower. So when we talk about the nervous system, there are four important things to keep in mind. The first thing is the brain, which is the center. The second thing is the sense organs, which collect impressions and send them to the brain. The third thing to keep in mind is the muscles. And then there are the nerves, and the nerves are like cables for transmitting nervous energy to muscles. So you can see the diagram on the right-hand side show that there's the brain, the spinal cord, the nerves, the sense organs, all work together to create the nervous system. Let's take a more visual look of what this is all about. So the top left-hand corner, we're going to look at the sense organs. So what are those sense organs? We've got the skin, the tongue, eyes, ears, nose, and they are responsible for all sorts of different senses. With the skin, we have touch, pressure, and temperature, right? All of those senses go through the skin. And then we have the tongue for taste, and the eyes take in the light, and that allows us to see color, dimension, and shape. And then we have the ears for sound and balance, and they hear pitch and loudness. And then there's the nose, which is the sense of smell. Now we have an area of the classroom in the primary classroom in Montessori that deals with the refinement of the senses. So we have works in the area of the room called sensorial materials. It's the sensorial area, and it's all about refining those senses. So when it comes to the skin, we refine that sense of touch, right? That sense of temperature, that sense of weight when a child holds something. And we also have our tasting bottles. And then when it comes to the visual sense, we have works that refine the sense of color, dimension, and shape. So all of that is being refined in the sensorial area. We also have different works to refine the sense of sound, right? For your ears. We have the bells, which work with pitch, and then we have the cylinders, which have to do with loudness, decibels. And we do actually have a work in the sensorial area for smelling and differentiating the sense of smell. So those are the sense organs, and we do refine that a lot in the Montessori classroom. All the way to the right, we have the nervous system. And she called them those cables that transport those impressions that we take in through the sense organs, that nervous energy, and sends it all to the brain. So in my chapter, in my book, it starts on page 123, and Maria Montessori says, "It is high time that movement came to be regarded from a new point of view in educational theory. Especially in childhood, we misunderstand its nature, and a number of mistaken ideas make us think of it as something less noble than it actually is. As a part of school life, which gives priority to the intellect, the role of movement has always been sadly neglected. When accepted there at all, it has only been under the heading of exercise, physical education, or games. But this is to overlook its close connection with the developing mind. Movement is the final result to which the working of all these delicate mechanisms leads up. If we take up animal observation, the first thing that strikes us is that animals can only express themselves through their movements. So it hardly seems logical in the case of man to ignore the whole of this side of his existence. So when we're talking about all these different types of systems, the brain, the muscles, the sense organs, the nerves, we call that a system of relationships. So this is really important with Montessori, that we understand this system of relationship. And Maria Montessori says, this is what puts man in touch with his world, living and non-living, and therefore with other people. Without its help, a man could have no contact with his surroundings or his fellows. She goes on to say, compared with this, all the other arrangements of the human body are, so to speak, selfish. because they serve only the person himself. They enable him to keep alive, or as we say, to vegetate, and therefore they are called organs and systems of the vegetative life. The vegetative systems only help their owner to grow and exist. It is the system of relationship which puts him into contact with the world. So let's look at that one more time. The system of relationship, Maria Montessori says, is what puts us into contact with the world, both living and non-living, and with other people. So that's really important for how we connect with the world. She goes on to say, one of the greatest mistakes of our day is to think of movement by itself as something apart from their higher functions. Such a grave error cannot help but lead to injury. There comes about a separation between the life of movement and the life of thought. But to be always thinking of the mind on the one hand and the body on the other is to break the continuity that should reign between them. Watching a child makes it obvious that the development of his mind comes about through his movements. In the development of speech, for example, we see a growing power of understanding go side by side with an extended use of those muscles by which he forms sounds and words. Observations made on children the world over confirm that the child uses his movements to extend his understanding. And we talked a lot about that in the previous chapter, so if you haven't seen that, if you haven't watched those videos, go back and catch up on those. But we did talk about how the child has to develop his language. He has to develop the mechanism for speaking. He has to hear the sound, and that affects how his speech mechanisms develop. And it's through that development of movement, the development of interaction with the world, that the child grows and refines the muscles and all the parts of speech. So that's what she's talking about right here. She says that voluntary muscles are directed by the brain and under the control of the will, and willpower is one of the highest expressions of the mind. And we talk a lot about willpower in Montessori. We talk about the child who has a will, or the development of the will, because in order for the child to have purposeful movement, the child has to have that willpower. And a child who doesn't have willpower does not have purposeful movement, or it might be haphazard movement or very chaotic movement. So she says, hence, if the voluntary muscles are directed by the will, they must form a kind of organ of the mind. All movement thus has a most intricate and delicate machinery, but in man, none of it is established at birth. It has to be formed and perfected by the child's activity in the world. We've touched on this in other chapters too, where when the child is born, he still has to create himself. There's so much about himself that has to be created, and that creation comes from contact with the world, with the absorption of his environment. The child has an internal power to bring about coordinations, which he thus creates himself, and once these have begun to exist, he goes on perfecting them by practice. The wonderful thing is that man's movements are not fixed and limited like those of the animals, but he can decide upon and choose those he will learn. But such versatility depends on work. They cost him the effort of much repetition, of practicing, and in the course of this, the muscles come to act in unison, because the nervous interconnections have an unconscious way of finding the needed harmony given an initiative provided by the will. So we have this initiative, right? This willpower. And then from that willpower, we have these actions. And through actions, we perfect ourselves. And that becomes the entire system of learning, and it affects both the mind and the body. The nature of a person's work is betrayed by his movements. For his work is the expression of his mind. It is his mental life. And this has access to a whole treasury of movements, which develop in the service of this, the central and directive part of his inner being. Should a man fail to develop his whole musculature, or as sometimes happens, should he develop only those muscles needed for heavy physical work, his mind also will stay at this low level at which his movements have remained. Thus, a person's mental life may be restricted by the type of work open to him or preferred by him. The mental life of anyone who does not work at all is in grave peril, because although it is true that all the muscular powers cannot be used, there is a limit beneath which it is dangerous for those in use to fall. When reduced below this level, a person's whole life is weakened. And we talk a lot about this in Montessori because we talk a lot about purposeful work. What is purposeful for the child? And in that purpose, the child will become normalized. In that purposeful work, the child will become normalized. So if we're seeing deviations, Maria Montessori said that the child needs purposeful work to bring them out of those deviations and into normalization. So this idea of purposeful work is at the center of the Montessori philosophy. And if you think about it, it really makes a lot of sense because it appeals to us as adults as well. If you think about that for a second, and you think about an adult who doesn't have purposeful work, and you think about what happens, you can see that those same deviations occur. So when we're thinking about children, we also have to think about purposeful work. And it's not going to look the same as an adult because the child's work is very different. The child's work is to create the man, to create the human, to create the adult. Without this companionship of movement, the brain develops on its own account, as if estranged from the results of its work. Movement not directed by the mind occur haphazardly and do harm. Its place is to serve the whole man and his life in relation to the outside world. And when that doesn't happen, when that movement doesn't have a purpose, we can see that movement also becomes chaotic. It becomes limited. Today's principles and ideas are too much set on self-perfection and self-realization. If we understand the true purposes of movement, the self-centeredness is bound to disappear. So let's stop for a second and think about what this means. Because we talk a lot about self-perfection in Montessori. The child is perfecting himself. However, it's not to the point of being narcissistic, right? It's not because the child is overwhelmed with himself, but because he's following the laws of nature. And what the child is working on, or even the adult is working on, should have a greater purpose than just to serve oneself. It becomes movement that connects to the outside world, movement that connects to others, movement that serves a greater purpose in community and around the world. So right here, we're looking at the idea of self-perfection on a different level than what the child is trying to perfect within himself. The child is following the laws of nature. As we get older, we're trying to perfect ourselves to acquire a skill, to be better at a skill. And if our goal in that is to be selfish and inward, it loses its purpose. So movement has to serve something. It has to serve a purpose. Just like everything else, we have to have a purpose. And that purpose has to go outside of ourselves. Maria Montessori says, work is inseparable from movement. The life of man and of the great human society is bound up with movement. And that is the summation of chapter 13. Now there's a lot more in chapter 13. So if you liked these ideas, go back, read the chapter for yourself, and dive a little deeper because she has a lot of thoughts in this chapter, but I tried to highlight ones that I thought were the most important. And let me know what you think about this idea of movement, because in Montessori, we really do focus on the refinement of movement. In fact, Maria Montessori says that that is a sensitive period in that 3 to 6 age group. The child is sensitive to refining movement during that age, and it's a window of opportunity to gain skills in that 3 to 6 environment that the child will never have again. Once that window of opportunity closes, it's going to be much more difficult for the child to refine that movement later on in life. And so when we talk about the refinement of movement, we usually connect that with the practical life area in the Montessori classroom. In the lessons that we do, a lot of the time, the direct purpose of the lessons in the practical life area is the control and coordination of movement. And we do that because, one, we really need to refine movement because that's the sensitive period, right? But also because the practical life area is where the child first connects with the community. It's where the child connects with others around them. It's where the child is socializing. It's where the child is learning skills that serve the community, as well as learning to be independent. And through these works, the child develops willpower. The child develops discipline. The child learns to concentrate, to focus, to repeat works. So a lot of what she's talking about right here takes place in that practical life area. It goes further, it goes into every area of the environment, but when we're talking about that coordination of movement, we're talking a lot about starting in that practical life area and then moving outward. Same thing when it comes to the refinement of the senses. We start in the sensorial area and we move outwards. It affects all of life, but we start there and then it moves outward. So anyways, if you like what you heard here, give it a thumbs up, like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.